Fat people are the last people you can actually now make jokes about. And in a world which is sort of defined by political correctness, as the United States, and by the way, Europe too, has become, you have to ask the question, why are fat people the last people who are stigmatized? And the answer is none of us, including the fattest of us, imagine us to be really fat. Well, certainly the swine flu epidemic of 1976 became an epidemic because we were told it was going to become an epidemic. And there's an argument, and I think a good one, that every time an epidemic is predicted, it's predicted for political rather than epidemiological reasons. That is, we need at a certain time to worry about the world and not the politics of the world. And epidemics seem to be something separate from politics. But of course, in a global world, epidemics are part of politics. Well, certainly in 2009, the swine flu epidemic, which we don't call the swine flu epidemic anymore, we call it the H1N1 epidemic, or in Israel, the Mexican epidemic, we have seen how politics and world politics have shaped an anxiety going back to George Bush as president about the potential for an epidemic, which had to be realized. You couldn't maintain people's anxiety about avian flu. And if pigs could fly, we'd have flying pigs flu today. Our fear of mental illness is a fear of our own instability. And there isn't any historical period, none, at least ones we have historical records for, in which mental illness was not one of the most feared aspect. It was feared because all of us think of ourselves as potentially mentally ill. And since mental illness is the most common form of illness, that's not really wrong. Certainly in the United States, in the 1960s, when we began to downsize the size of mental institutions, of asylums, and deinstitutionalize people who now live on the streets of our big cities and our small towns, one of the things we refused to do was to acknowledge that they are us. They are part of our world. They are our sons, they are our fathers, they are our daughters, they are our mothers. I think one of the ways of ameliorating the fear of mental illness is to acknowledge that there we all go at some point in our own lives. We've never kept the promise to create small, comfortable, secure living units for people with mental illness. And it's a promise that would, in point of fact, desensitize us to their presence in our societies if they live next to us, and surprise, surprise, we're just like us. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church promulgated a list of the 10 deadly sins, including gluttony, avarice. And last year, they gave us a new list of the 10 modern deadly sins. And gluttony's there, and avarice has become now part of the banking system, so it sort of disappeared. But we always create categories of excess. They're not excesses when we do them, of course. They're just excesses when somebody else does them. Our eating well is somebody else's gluttony. Our earning a good living is somebody else's avarice. We have sin taxes. We tax those things which at least American society in the 19th century thought were morally bad for us: alcohol and booze, and maybe soon fatty foods and marijuana. But there's sin taxes which support the good works of society. Do we really want people to stop drinking and eating fatty foods? Do we want them to give up the vices? If they do, who pays for our schools? One of the things that really bothers me is the reappearance of race as a category in medical science. in evidence-based medical science today in the 21st century. It existed in the 19th century. People were able to talk about those diseases of the African Americans that caused them to run away from slavery. They were able to talk about the diseases of the Jews that made it impossible for them to become citizens in the modern world. Somewhere or another, the term race has reappeared. Now, of course, it refers to genetic cohorts, which sometimes, but not always, mean groups of people who share certain characteristics that are observable. We should be very careful about confusing genetic cohorts with race. The new study that looks at the genetic cohorts in sub-Saharan Africa points out that it is the most genetically diverse place in the world. There is no African race. There are at least 44 of them. In evidence-based medicine, starting about 20 years ago, the census categories from the US Census, which described African Americans or Hispanics as groups, became used in testing drugs. They became races, which is very weird because, of course, they weren't so considered in the census. Every 10 years, we change these categories. You shouldn't be able to change them in evidence-based medicine. The reappearance of race is a danger because what it does is conflate political categories with genetic categories. And not only are they not the same, they oftentimes do not overlap. There's been a great deal of interest in whether or not one could diagnose and treat specific illnesses, hypertension, for example, in specific groups, races, if you would. African Americans have a high rate of hypertension. Well, there are interesting questions about that. Is that a problem of a genetic cohort? Well, the equivalent genetic cohorts in Africa don't have high rates of hypertension. Maybe it has to do with the social position as well as the genetic predisposition of an individual in a group. One wants to be very careful about confusing political categories, African Americans as a political group, an economic group, a social group, with a genetic cohort which may overlap with African Americans in the United States, but not with their ancestors and antecedents in Africa. One of the things that's so exciting right now in the medical humanities is the fact that we are integrating clinical knowledge, social knowledge, and cultural knowledge in order to teach both the undergraduates who are going to become physicians and physicians in training. The exciting thing, and it's really happening here at Emory, is that we are starting to think about all of the knowledge, the epidemiological knowledge, the genetic knowledge, the social knowledge, and the cultural knowledge in their historical ramifications. That's what's new, and that's what's hot here at Emory.